So maybe we'll start now. Yeah, and we just want to make sure we give people a very clear indication that we're recording, which is started, and we will be sharing this session on YouTube channel. So just for full disclosure. So thank you, everyone. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening for joining the ASA Biopharm Safety Working Group scientific webinar. And I am one of your co-hosts, together with Susan Mayo, who will talk later as well. And thanks to Michelle's support, she has been, the people behind the scene that we're able to be here today smoothly. So my name is Moon-Chun Lee, and for those of you who knows me or you don't yet, I am one of the co-chair of the ASA Biopharm Safety Working Groups. And the working group itself has a official public-private partnership with US FDA. And there are 3 work streams under the safety working group. Work stream 1, 2, 3, very straightforward. And we also have a communication and outreach team that is led by Michelle. So the scientific webinar is something the communication and outreach team does on a quarterly basis. So we have been doing this in the past few years. We obviously will continue. And very recently, we started to disseminate information on social media, such as LinkedIn and Twitter, and again, we're broadcasting this event on YouTube. So for today's topic, which again, Susan will talk a little bit further, but the key word is really benefit risk, right? So as the working group, we are not directly worked, in the process of writing the CIOM's benefit risk report, but we do have work streams, our task forces that are work very closely on the same topic, benefit risk assessment. So precisely, we have BRAP and BRATS, as you can see from the name, benefit risk assessment planning, benefit risk assessment tool suite. So after today's presentation, we will have discussant talk about what we see as a working group, some gaps or some strengths that we can learn from the CIOM's working group and what the implications might be to the working group. So we will be talking about a lot of terms from our task forces, including ASAP and ISG. So I want to give you that background that, those are all the 4 task forces under Workstream 1. And obviously, the 4 task forces are not working in silo. We're actually working very collaboratively with each other. Just very briefly, the ISG tool, the interactive safety graphics, which is already out there and in the public domain, providing the same technology and platform for the BRATs, which again, we'll go back to the end of the cycle. But the ISG tool is providing a very interactive and very fancy tool to help people conducting aggregated safety analysis, which really fit into the ASAP idea. That is to encourage sponsors to look into the aggregate safety data from the very beginning and all the way along the development and even into post-marketing. And that idea is really fitting to what the BRAP team is doing, the Benefit Risk Assessment Planning Task Force. And here they are talking about sponsors should do benefit risk assessment from the very beginning as well and throughout the entire life cycle. So adding the benefit and risk together sort of build on the ASAP idea as well. And when we have the output from BRAP, we can also feed the output into the BRATS tool. So the tool, the visualization tool, can help sponsors to better understand, the analysis and also to facilitate the communication within the sponsor or even with the health authority or with other key stakeholders. So that's kind of the idea of how different, task forces are working together. But again, the purpose of here is really to let you know of the work we have been doing and also to give you some background to understand the terminology layer. With that said, I would just say, if you're interested to join us, if you haven't, you can contact us, with this Gmail email, send us the email or visit the website for more information. Okay. With that said, I will pass the ball to Susan for a little bit more intro. Susan.
Thank you, Meng-Chun. Today, we have the pleasure of having 2 of the committee members from CIOM's Working Group 12 the benefit risk report they will outline the benefit risk landscape and promoting the use of the structured benefit risk framework from the beginning and continuously updated and applied throughout the product life cycle, including key decision-making steps. The report also mentioned the visualization of benefit risk assessment and its importance in the benefit risk process. So as Meng Chun was describing a couple of the task forces within this ASA safety working group, ASA DIA safety working group, we have the benefit of this broader CIOMS document. And you may know that oftentimes CIOMS documents end up having an influence on later guidance. So with that, I would like to turn it over first to Hong Yang, who is affiliated with CBER. Hong is not only a member of the CIOMS 12 working group, but also a member of our safety working group. So over to you, Hong. Thank you for your presentation today.
Okay. Thank you for mentioning and Susan for lay down the background of the working group. So I'm Hong Yang. I'm Senior Advisor for Benefit Risk Assessment in the Division of Analytical and Benefit Risk Assessment, Office of Biostatistics and Pharmacovigilance in CBER. I has been lead many quantitative benefit risk assessment in CBER to inform the regulatory decision. So today I have pleasure to come here to give you an update about the CIOMS report. Hold on. So do I share my screen or I can I share my screen so I can forward my slide?
Yes, you can. I'm sharing now.
Uh-huh.
You can just let me know next or you
okay, I will can you close that? I can share my screen so I can move forward myself.
Okay. Hold on. I will stop sharing. Wait. Stop sharing. Okay. See if we can share now.
Did you see my screen?
Actually, yes.
Okay, good. Let me see. Okay. Okay, so this is FDA disclaimer.
Excuse me, Hong, you're sharing the presenter's view rather than the presentation view. Could you flip that, please? That swap, that should work. Very good. Thank you.
Okay, good. Thank you. Okay, so let's see how this works. Okay, so the CIOM is stand for the Council for International Organization of Medical Science. It is a international, non-governmental and non-profit organization. It is established jointly by WHO and UNICO in 1949. CIOM's mission is to advance public health through guidance on health research, include ethics, medical products, medical products development and safety. Several CIOMS pharmacovigilance guidance has been served as a basis for the later ICH guidance. The CIOMS working group 12 on benefit risk balance for medicinal products was launched in September 2019. And it includes participants from industry, regulator, academia, and the World Health Organization. The aim is to put forward a life cycle based benefit risk approach to support decision making and transparent communication. My presentation will first give you a brief overview of CIOMS report. And then I will focus on Chapter 2, the Structured Benefit Risk Approach and Framework. And this chapter will have 4 sections: component of Structured Benefit Risk Framework, life cycle approach, role of patients in structured framework, additional quantitative analysis. So first, I will give you an overview. The CIOMS report includes 4 chapters. The chapter 1 is benefit risk landscape. So in this chapter, CIOMS report provides some background on the various international benefit risk initiatives that have shaped the benefit risk assessment field also, this chapter will provide information on the up-to-date benefit risk context and the novel approach and method. The chapter 2 provides overview of the component of a structured benefit risk assessment framework, the product life cycle approach, and the contribution of the patient to the benefit risk assessment. So I will present more detail about this chapter 2. And the chapter 3 will cover the benefit risk methodological principle and consideration. Leo, my colleague, will present more detail of this chapter. Chapter 4 of the report discusses 5 special situations where uncertainty about the risk and benefit of the products is high. Considering time constraint, we will not present this chapter in this seminar. You can read CIOMS report for more detail. The highlight of the CIOMS report include: first, it proposed a structured benefit risk framework. We consider this framework as a core for all the benefit risk assessment. The risk assessment includes drug, biologic, and device, which can be supported by the additional quantitative analysis for some complex benefit risk decision. The second highlight of the report is the life cycle approach for benefit risk assessment. It's starting from early drug development and through product life cycle. And so from those whole life cycle, we try to use benefit risk assessment to establish benefit risk balance of a product. And this benefit risk assessment can reach after post-marketing to reassess this balance periodically in the post-market setting. The third highlight is a transition from early benefit risk, more focused on evaluation of as a post-hoc exercise. But in this report, we highlight a transition to more proactively incorporate benefit risk consideration into the benefit risk planning. That include clinical trial design, data collection, and the risk management. The fourth highlight of the report is the importance of seeking out and including the patient's voice in the assessment of benefit risk. The fifth highlight is a pragmatic, patient-centered approach to the benefit risk assessment to ensure proper reflection and evaluation of the benefit and risk as a experience by the patient. And the final highlight is the novel methodology to address uncertainty and visualize the benefit risk assessment. So now I will to make focus on my presentation on the chapter 2. First, the science group proposed a structure framework that include the component summarized in this slide. So this framework incorporates the common components from multiple existing framework developed early by many different organization, agency, or working group. CION report proposed framework include 4 components. First is product opportunity. That will in considering disease condition and treatment landscape. The product profile include key benefit and risk of products and the uncertainty on this benefit risk evidence. A risk management plan is to further characterize the risk and to reduce the uncertainty, to minimize the risk to the patient. And the final component of the benefit risk assessment is to make final conclusion based on above 3 components, and also considering appropriate benefit risk trade-off. For the first component, product opportunity, we have 2 major sections. One section discusses disease condition and unmet medical need. And then the second section discusses about the treatment option. So under disease condition and unmet medical need, we need to understanding the instance and the prevalence of the disease among the population. What is the size of impact population, severity and duration of the disease symptom and outcome, as well as we need to know how those outcomes impact patients' quality of the life, burden to the caretaker. For some products, we also need, for example, like vaccine, we also need to consider societal and public health implication. So, and the second section is about the treatment option. So we need to consider what is the currently available disease treatment option. We need to consider the option includes standard care, treatment for cure, or the care to manage the disease. What are the target population and benefit and risk to the patient of those options? And how will the new products we are develop will fill in the unmet medical need from those available options. The unmet medical need need to be considered not only efficacy and safety, but also consider convenience of use and patient preference, and the special need for us, a patient subpopulation. The product profile is about the evidence to demonstrate the key benefit and key risk of the products. The key benefit and risk are critical for determining an acceptable benefit-risk balance in the context of product opportunity. The key benefit and key risk to be included in the benefit-risk assessment should be discussed among multiple multifunctional benefit-risk management team. A value tree shown in this slide can be used to facilitate the discussion and communicate among the team. For selection of the key benefit endpoint, major consideration include intended use, target population, unmet medical need, clinical relevance, patient preference, and so on. They should be considered when designing clinical endpoint used in the clinical trial. For selection of key risk endpoint, adverse reaction with severe or irreversible outcome with high incidence or long duration should be the focus. They could be a subset selected outcome from identified. Hello? From identified and potential risk included in the risk management plan. The difference is that a risk which is well understood or could be well mitigated with a risk management plan may not need to be included in the key risk for the benefit risk assessment. The most important evidence for drug efficacy and safety typically came from clinical study of the clinical development program. Other tools are also used by companies to identify potential safety issues, especially for those risk issues from the drug class. The clinical trial should be designed to appropriately capture key benefit and risk using appropriate measurement at the appropriate time point to reflect benefit and risk for overall patient population or a specific subpopulation. The data should be analyzed according with statistical analysis plan to generate reliable evidence for benefit risk assessment. Real-world evidence becomes important, especially for drugs to treat a rare disease where larger clinical trial is infeasible, or emergency use of a product for life-threatening disease without other treatment options. Real-world evidence needs to be evaluated separately for its strengths, limitation, and relevance to the context of decision, and should be interpreted appropriately. When making conclusion about the benefit-risk balance, it is important to consider all uncertainty associated with benefit-risk evidence and to evaluate the potential impact of those uncertainty on benefit-risk balance. We need to be aware of not only known uncertainty, as well as potential unknown uncertainty. Source of uncertainty could relate to the clinical trial design, conduct of clinical trial. It may deviate from study protocol, data integrity and the quality of the data, and also extrapolation of the result from clinical trial to the real world setting. Sion's framework made it very clear that risk management is a part of consideration leading to benefit-risk conclusion. It is not just an activity post-benefit-risk decision. A decision about benefit risk balance is made considering the tolerance for uncertainty, along with appreciation of whether the uncertainty can be addressed, how rapidly it can be addressed, and whether risk can be minimized to ensure benefit outweigh the risks. And the second section of this chapter is life cycle approach. One of the new concepts from this SIOMS report is the life cycle approach. In the earliest SIOMS report about benefit risk assessment, it's more focused on the post-market benefit risk assessment. But for this SIOMS report, life cycle approach is a new concept. There are two aspects of the life cycle approach. First, benefit risk should be started as early as possible and continue through the life cycle up to even after the post-marketing. The second aspect is a transition from a post-hoc benefit risk exercise to proactively incorporate benefit risk consideration into benefit risk planning, data collection, and evidence generation, benefit risk assessment, decision-making at each stage of the life cycle. At the preclinical phases, the major activity related to drug development are to assess product opportunity, select compound, identify target population, determine dose and safety margin, and prepare the first in-human clinical trial. At this stage, toxicology, pharmacology, and some other non-clinical data are collected. Benefit risk assessment is mostly qualitative to inform decisions about goal and non-goal for clinical study and to inform target safety monitoring and risk minimization if a decision is made to move forward the clinical trial. At the early product development stage, which include phase 1 and 2 clinical trial, the knowledge about the benefit and risk is limited. The major aim are to determine a safe dose range in human and monitoring potential risk, identify unknown risk, and assess the potential drug effect. The end of phase 2 may be a critical point for benefit risk planning based on available information about the treatment effect and safety of the drug. It informs phase 3 clinical trial design about appropriate inclusion-exclusion criteria, drug dose, efficacy and safety endpoint, and risk monitoring and mitigation plan. Phase 3 clinical trial is a critical stage to collect data and generate evidence for benefit risk assessment. Considering structured benefit risk framework, principle, and sound methodology when design a clinical trial and develop a good statistical analysis plan is very important to help to generate relevant and quality evidence for benefit risk assessment. When a drug is approved for marketing, a conclusion has been reached that when used in accordance with approved indication, the product's non-benefit outweighs its non-risk. If a new information emerges post-marketing, is expected to change the benefit risk profile of a product, benefit risk assessment should be redone to reevaluate whether the benefit of the products continue outweigh the risk, and whether additional risk minimization activity are needed. One highlight for this SIOMS report is the role of the patient in the structured benefit risk framework. Patients' experience and input can help every aspect of structured benefit risk framework. First, it helps to identify the unmet medical need and better understanding how the disease and current treatment impact patients' life. Second, it helps to identify the target patient population, benefit risk, and benefit risk attributes, which are important to the patient and should be included in the benefit risk assessment. Third, the patient's preference on clinical outcome and tolerance for risk and uncertainty should be considered when making the benefit risk trade-off. This slide shows the role of patient input at the different stage of the product's life cycle. At the preclinical and early drug development, patient experience on disease condition and available treatment help to identify unmet medical need and target population and appropriate study endpoint. At the clinical stage, patient experience and reported outcome help assess burden of new treatment, patient preference on different outcome attributes. At the post-marketing phases, patient can help to develop an effective communication plan and evaluate effectiveness and burden of risk mitigation measures. In the last section of this chapter, we discuss additional quantitative analysis that to support structured benefit risk framework. And this diagram represents a decision tree for when the additional quantitative analysis can help structure benefit risk framework, how that will be incorporated into the overall benefit risk assessment. SIOMS report emphasizes structured benefit risk framework is a core for all the benefit risk assessment. However, for complex decision problem, additional quantitative analysis may provide added value and support benefit structure framework. The decision tree elaborates the rule of the quantitative analysis. So from here, you can see we first need to consider when we're doing benefit risk assessment, we always need to consider this the core dimension of the structure framework, disease condition, treatment option, benefit and risk management. And then we consider, based on those evidence, we consider benefit risk trade-off. In many cases, it's very clear based on those evidence, benefit is clear outweigh the risk. All benefit risk is clearly outweigh the benefit. So under these two situations, you can make decision very clear, either go or no go. However, in some situations, either the benefit risk is marginal, it's very difficult to make trade-off, or there is high uncertainty related to either benefit evidence or risk evidence. So under this situation, we may consider the additional quantitative analysis. However, it's very important, to understand your quantitative analysis is totally driven by your critical knowledge gap. that are very important for your decision. So when you try to develop additional quantitative analysis, you need to be very clear what is your critical research question. So with that context, you try to select appropriate methodology to try to address that question. Therefore, there's no uniform one single formula for additional quantitative analysis that is really driven by your question. Also, you need to evaluate your data. Only when you have data that appropriate for this analysis, your analysis result will be informative. Otherwise, will be garbage in, garbage out. You will miss the analysis, not even useful, could even be misleading. And after you conduct this analysis, you take this analysis result as a part of your overall evidence. Go back to your structural framework and to make decision with the knowledge data gap was filled with your quantitative analysis. So in summary, Sion's report proposed a structured benefit risk framework, which incorporates components of product opportunity, product profile, risk management, and then finally make a benefit risk conclusion. It highlights life cycle approach to the benefit risk assessment and propose a transition from a previous post-hoc benefit risk exercise to the proactively incorporating benefit risk consideration into the benefit risk planning at each stage of the product's development. It emphasized the importance of incorporating patient input in each component of the structured benefit risk framework and in benefit risk assessment at each stage of the life cycle. It emphasized structured benefit risk framework is a core for all benefit risk assessment. An additional quantitative benefit risk assessment with some methodology and fit-for-purpose data can be used to support structured benefit risk framework for under a complex decision. But it's very important to emphasize this additional quantitative benefit risk assessment is not to replace structured benefit risk framework. So that concludes the chapter 2. So here is our Sion's working group members picture here. Do we have any question here, or we want to have question at the end?
Michelle, do you
Let's
see
see.
any question right now?
I didn't see any question right now, so probably we can wait until the Q&A session.
Yeah.
Okay, I
Yeah,
can stop my sharing and so this give
Yes,
to
thank you,
Leo.
Hong. Yes, and our next speaker, thanks to Hong Yang. Hong invited her SIAMS 12 colleague, Leo Plouffe, from the Global Head of Patient Safety from Gilead, who will speak now about Chapter 3 of the SIAMS report, SIAMS 12 report. Over to you, Leo.
Great, thank you very much. Tough act to follow with following Hong Yang, but very, very happy to join, and good morning, afternoon, and evening to everybody. So it's really an honor to share the output from our subgroup, which was leading the Chapter 3 effort for SIAMS 12. If we go on to the next slide. So I started this work while I was at Bayer, and now I'm with Gilead, but the views really do not reflect the company view. They really reflect those of the working group. So we thought, next slide, please. Perfect, that's the right slide. we thought it'd be helpful to highlight really sections, key points in each of the sections in Chapter 3. So we'll talk about applying benefit risk methodologies across the many dimensions of the patient care, and the fact that there are different benefit risk methodologies for different treatment modalities and then applications. So we'll go over that in a second. We'll talk about the evolution of benefit risk assessment in terms of study design, statistical approaches. We'll go into methodological consideration to gain patient insight, a methodological consideration to address uncertainties, approaches to visualization, and then the multidisciplinary benefit risk team. So one of the key concepts that really we owe Hong to highlight for all of us is historically there's been an approach to benefit risk that was breaking it up into three big buckets, either qualitative, semi-quantitative, or quantitative. And ultimately, one of the challenges of that approach is we all recognize that what's called qualitative benefit risk usually relies upon very elaborate statistical methods to assess pivotal clinical trials in a registration setting. And so to call that qualitative is greatly underestimating the relevance of these data. And so the new proposal here is to have either basic or core benefit risk assessment, which forms the basis, and that includes all the traditional statistical methods that go behind all of that. And then as needed, and how often that is needed may be, probably 80-20, so less than 20% of the time are additional elements needed. But those additional elements would include additional quantitative analyses, visualization tool, additional patient insights beyond those that we get, simulation models, and then a range of other methodologies. So really important to gather that concept, and it permeates the entire study design. Next slide, please. So one of the things that's important is to apply the benefit risk methodologies with different scope and purpose. So what do we mean by that? If we go on to the next slide, is ultimately all of the work we do is to help better inform the interface with the individual patient. And that interface is really related to the physician interface. So in that context, the focus of CIOMS 12 is at the pivotal, very essential base of individual medicinal products, FOXA1. However, we recognize that more and more patients are also being offered or treated in parallel with medical devices. There's a rapid evolution of diagnostics, including companion diagnostics. Many times it's a decision between undergoing a surgical procedure or a medical procedure compared to taking the medicinal product. And then, the assessment is up to 80% of patients will use some form of over-the-counter consumer health product, complementary medicine, or lifestyle modification. And all of those things interplay, but the benefit risk and analysis that's applied to each of these may be quite different. Then you have the context in which the patient accesses this care, the socioeconomic, the psychosocial dynamics, the local healthcare system, and then ultimately it reaches the individual patient. So if we go to the next slide, we highlight some of those elements. So if we look at the medical device world, it's a risk analysis, risk evaluation approach that's used. For medical and surgical intervention, these are generally based on published literature where there's a variable quality of evidence and different statistical approaches. Many of the ultimate decisions by clinicians are based on committee opinion guidelines, expert reports, or meta-analyses, all of which have their own approach to benefit risk analysis. consumer health products, for example, if they're over the counter, they may fall under the food safety guidelines as opposed to medicinal product benefit risk analysis. And again, highly variable quality and of evidence of statistical analysis. The socioeconomic context is generally addressed by health technology assessments, which is again a very elaborate way of assessing benefit risk, but differs to what we're generally considering for medicinal product. And last but not least is to consider the generalizability of finding. What are the local medical care standard? What are the patient and environmental situation and lifestyle that could impact the benefit risk? So it's really important to consider of all these. So the next one is highlighting study design and statistical approach, and we can go on to the next slide. So we highlight here the classic study design with efficacy data set, a separate safety data set, which is derived from the overall same universe, but basically we're looking at two different things. And the realization that historically, when we've conducted benefit risk assessment, has been a post-hoc exercise. So that's kind of where we have been and where we still are today. The future is likely to come from one of the additional methods presented. So one of them is the patient level benefit risk analysis, which we're very fortunate that Scott Evans is a member of the writing group. So he highlights very clearly that approach, which many of you are very familiar with, including tools such as the DOOR. Estimance is another approach, and then the role of pragmatic and large simple trials in the assessment of benefit risk. So where do we stand on this? Well, essentially, some very clear recommendations at various steps of the clinical trial process. So at the design level, the idea is to pre-specify benefit risk endpoint, possibly representing a global patient outcome, and do this in the trial protocol in parallel to efficacy and safety endpoints, really for transparency. Carefully construct a structured data collection schedule to provide a comprehensive assessment of both nature, severity, and timing of benefit. Description in the statistical analysis protocol, pre-specify procedures for the subgroups, and then looking at late-stage clinical trials to evaluate the clinical utility based on benefit risk endpoints. So very clear, specific recommendations. On the side of the clinical trial conduct, again, it's making sure that we monitor both benefit and risk is in a comprehensive, integrated fashion. And regardless of how we're randomizing the patient, really approaching both efficacy and safety data with the same approach, possibly with the ITT. On the statistical analysis slide, next slide. Presenting those benefit risk endpoint as a standard section in the clinical study report, conducting benefit risk analysis under the ITT, consider very liberal active use of absolute risk, and identify subgroups and estimate effects within the subgroups for benefit risk. Next slide. Obviously, then clear reporting of these benefit risk endpoints, and all those elements would really advance the science of conducting clinical trials with benefit risk in mind. We also commented very briefly, but provided robust example of additional quantitative analysis. So that's in those instances where there is a need for additional quantitative analyses to better clarify the benefit risk. And these include a number of very traditional methods, including MCDA estimation techniques, and also simulations such as Monte Carlo simulation. And again, we have very nice examples provided. Next slide. Very, very important is how do we include the voice of the patient, but especially specific type of patient insights So next slide. We looked at the role of patient preference studies and look at both qualitative and quantitative methods. And how qualitative are really provide insights into what matters the most to patients. And these are very important in the overall benefit risk assessment. And quantitative is helpful in using to determine how much patient value different alternatives. So very important role for both, but also different. And then a very nice approach to the preference elicitation method, talking about discrete choice-based ranking in different techniques and rating. And again, a nice description of these. And next slide. And also a reference to all the great work that the IMI Prefer group did with the methods they selected around DCE, best worst scaling, threshold technique, and swing weighting. Next slide. Then we looked about uncertainty, which is a key element. And just next one, the key sources of uncertainty and benefit risk are listed: human variability, the statistical, the clinical, methodological, and also the unknown unknowns, which is always the challenging one. And we describe in the section statistical approaches, probabilistic, uncertainty considerations and how to deal with them, and as well as strategies and the uncertainty reduction theory framework for uncertainty reduction strategy. So a very important aspect which is developed. As approaches to visualization is a key element. There, to be honest, we thought there's so much good external sources of information, including the one put out by this ASA group, but we nonetheless highlighted the attribute or the value tree, the effects table from EMA, and also a range of graphic tools. Probably one of the most novel approach is to talk in terms of the specifics of having a multidisciplinary benefit risk team and a new document that's referred to as the BRAD, and we'll come back to that in a second. So the multidisciplinary team is really felt to be an essential component. We've already gotten a lot of external feedback, and our construct at the CIOMS level is that the safety assessment team or the safety management team is already a very good core to draw upon. So sometimes it's just a matter of enhancing membership in that team, or it could be a separate team. Because companies are so different, we highlighted the skill set that should be part of the benefit risk team. So there should be a product lead and a team leader, and that sometimes is the same person. Sometimes it's 5 different people. On the safety side, there should be a physician, pharmacovigilance scientist, again, many times this is one and the same, and a risk manager. And again, many times it's one and the same person, or it could be 3 people or more. Clinical is another important component. Regulatory affairs, clinical pharmacology, included pharmacokinetics. And again, there could be 1 or more person. Toxicology could be 1 or more person. Similarly on the CMC, manufacturing and control. And obviously, since this is an ASA group, biostatistics is essential. And again, here it could be, a group of 1 or many. So what is the BRAD? Well, it's not Brad Pitt or Brad Paisley, but the BRAD is just an acronym that we're proposing, and companies already have such documents with different names, but it's the idea to have a company level benefit risk assessment document. And the components we're proposing there as a guideline, and again, this is just a guideline, is to have very clearly at the beginning what the indication is, the effective date of the document, version number, replaces which prior version, and why was there an update made. So just a very easy tracking tool. Then there's an executive summary, and this includes generally the benefit summary and assessment in an FDA format. And there's great strength in this because the FDA, as you know, upon initial approval at least, puts out this benefit summary and assessment grid. And so it's a nice starting point to look at and compare. And then if available and appropriate at the stage of development, an effect stable. Module 1 captures the analysis of condition. Module 2, current treatment options. Module 3, benefit. Module 4, risk and risk management. And Module 5, annexes. So up on 1, 2, 3, 4, you're very familiar. That's what Hong very well described. The Module 5 annexes are really, really important. So it is a summary of risk management activities during drug development, and this enables, and indeed a number of companies have now done away with having a DRMP. So the BRAD can effectively replace the DRMP and potentially other documents. Table 2 is an important one. It's a summary table of uncertainties, and this captures very crisply what the uncertainties are in the program and the expected time at which the uncertainty will be discharged during the development. So let's say we're doing something that could be related to animal toxicology. It could be that you capture, the uncertainty for potential risk of malignancy, and this will be discharged by end of phase 2 or end of phase 3. Or it could be uncertainty around a rare clinical event, such as, encephalopathy or something like that, and the fact that it cannot be discharged until the post-marketing stage. So it's a very helpful referral tool for decision-making throughout the process. The Annex 3 is looking at local or regional considerations where the use of the medication because of local circumstances may differ and therefore could impact the benefit risk assessment for the product. And then Annex 4 captures the changes to the BRAD document over time. Module 6 provides the references in the document, and 7, which is very helpful to the team, is key example and resources. The other important concept for the BRAD is that it lives throughout the life cycle, and it is meant to potentially be initiated, and that's the case that we're using right now at Gilead, and we were using at Bayer, to initiate prior to phase 1. So it's a very early document. And in this way, the BRAD is a continuous interaction with other key documents. So it includes protocols, the IB, the IND submission, the DCSI, and very importantly, on the commercial side, the target product profile. If you're starting a BRAD later on in development, and a number of companies decide to do this in phase 2 or later, you can then inform the BRAD from those other documents. So there's a lot of flexibility there. The key thing is to avoid duplication. And if your company, for example, uses medical writing as a core assembler of documents, if you can get them involved in this, it's a very, very helpful process. So that's essentially the elements. And again, to come back to thank all our colleagues on whose behalf we're presenting the information today. Very, very exciting to share this with you. And hopefully you all appreciate this. This may provide some guidance to advance the field. I'll stop here.
Thank you very much, Leo. I see there is one question in the chat. Meng-Chun, do you think that's okay if we take that question now before we go to our panelists?
Yeah, I think that's perfect.
Yes, and I see Susan Kalila has a question too. So Yulia City asks, first says, thank you for this very informative webinar. Could you please provide an example of a benefit risk endpoint? Are there any publicly available protocols that outlined it?
Yeah, so maybe I can comment on this. So as I said, Scott is really the probably one of the world leaders in this whole domain. So you can look his publications, and will provide a lot of interest in that. One of the key concept there is that you need to look at the patient level, for which patients will have a benefit and a risk. So the notion is some patients can experience a benefit only with no risk. Some patients can experience a risk with no benefit, and other patients can have the benefit and the risk at the same time. And it's really important to sort that out. So this is where heat maps can help, defining all the patients that have benefit, all the patients that have risk, and the patients that have both benefit and risk. So that's one key concept that underlies this. Another classic benefit risk one has been in the area of stroke, where you have hemorrhagic stroke and you have embolic stroke. And this is obviously, for the patient, it's both a stroke, but some medications will prevent the embolic stroke, but may increase the risk for hemorrhagic stroke. So it's really being able to distinguish that on the benefit risk side and distinguish between those two events, and then how to analyze them. That's kind of the endpoint, another classic endpoint in that area. So hopefully that gives a little bit more clarity there.
Thank you, Leo. I know it's hard to capture an answer in in a small period of time. It's a big topic. Susan, Kalila, did you have a question you'd like to ask?
Yes, I did. Hi, Leo. My question is for you, and basically on the recommended benefit risk team membership. I see I've just recently implemented a benefit risk assessment process to work at my company, Teva Pharmaceuticals. And we have a few more other roles. First of all, it's being led by epidemiology, which I see is lacking on that list of members. Though, we work with our biostats colleagues in terms of working on the analyses and such. But also the beginning of the FDA framework for benefit risk assessment is deals a lot with epidemiology and some health economic outcomes work, like burden of disease, unmet need, and those issues, which are in our camp. Also, we include our medical affairs colleagues as well, particularly when it's doing a benefit risk assessment sort of later in development. But even early on, when we're just trying to get an idea of what what's the other treatment landscape look like for our patients, and any other comparative drugs or standard of care options for the disease population. I just wanted to raise that and see if you have any opinion about that.
So I would say yes, yes, yes. So in the benefit risk assessment teams that I've been involved company-wide, all those individuals were present to be called upon, and all are involved. And indeed, they're very, very critical there. So I think it's important. We didn't do a great job in the chapter. We tried to stay neutral, and we probably were too neutral and too uncommittal. So we will take your comment, as well as a lot of the written comments we've received, to be better in that. So to be honest, in the details there on the biostats that included epidemiology and real world evidence expertise and so on. I think the one element that we think is important to avoid, because of trying to initiate the document early, is an undue focus on the pharmacoeconomics. So that's the one part we would recommend keeping out of it at that point. But there are incredible insights to be gained by work in pharmacoeconomics. So, patient preferences and stuff like that. So it's a matter of reaching the right balance there. But, the more the merrier from my side. And I think those are enrich the discussion.
Well, thank you. I just wanted to say that.
Thank you for your question, Susan, and thank you, Leo, for your comments as well as your presentation. Now we have a couple of folks from the working group. As I mentioned before, Hong Yang is also a member of the safety working group. First, though, in response to this, we have some comments from Lisa Rodriguez, who is one of the co-leaders of the Benefit Risk Assessment Planning Task Force. Over to you, Lisa.
Great, thank you, Susan. And I think this has been a great discussion so far. I wanted to focus my comments on, thank you, and there's our disclaimer. I wanted to focus my comments about the Benefit Risk Assessment Planning Task Force that's within the Greater Safety Working Group. And we really appreciated the SIOMS publication, and I think it's generated a lot of discussion. So my comments are going to be based on input from all of the members, and you can see my co-chairs there on the slide, Brian Edwards and James Higgison. And we have several FDA members as well as international members from industry organizations. So at the time the SIOMS recommendations were published, they did ask for feedback. So Lothar Trimmel compiled some comments. This is across the safety working group. A few gaps were identified, and I wanted to focus on a few things in particular relating to what we could think about in our task force, and kind of build off of SIOMS and perhaps fill some gaps with additional work that we might want to do. So one thing that was identified is perhaps to encourage uptake of the recommendations, more justification early in drug development could be part of recommendations perhaps that come out of BRAP, or thinking about this as SIOMS work is presented to users. The document is a bit long and scope is broad. I know the SIOMS group had their particular objectives, and I think when thinking about BRAP, we're thinking about could we be concisely focused on a few points that would be easily used, like a points to consider document. We're also thinking about a checklist, and I'll talk about those points in a minute. More details and examples. So we were also thinking there are a few concepts there that might be of particular interest. Perhaps we could put some examples in our BRAP. We're also thinking about rare diseases, so special cases where people might want to think about benefit risk. Someone had a comment about the definition of risk for an AE. So there's not a lot in there about the planning process, and I think perhaps that wasn't the intent of the SIOMS BRAD document, but certainly that's part of the intent of the BRAP task force. So again, thinking about what gaps we could fill and how could we respond to some of this work, we are focused on the planning process. And then relation of proposed BRAD document to other study planning documents, not necessarily detailed. So I think this is a particular viewpoint of the safety working group because we do have other task forces. We have ASAP, we have BRATS. So we're thinking from our perspective, how can we make sure to align with these different considerations as well when we think about benefit risk assessment and planning? We can go to, thank you. So we did want to focus also on the best features we thought from SIOMS. This was also some feedback. So we really like that this BRAD document took the transition of benefit risk from a post hoc exercise to proactively incorporating benefit risk considerations into clinical trial design. There was advocacy for including in clinical trial designs the patient-centric endpoints that capture both benefit and risk. So again, this is really important consideration. And again, something we would want to think about for BRAP. And there was a shift from evaluation of benefit risk from, I think in the past, being kind of opaque, unstructured ways done by individual experts towards a more structured, transparent, multi-stakeholder approach. So that's a great thing that's coming out of the SIOMS work. And of course, the need for benefit risk assessment early in drug development is expressed. So these are some great features we would like to continue to align with. So as I mentioned, we're thinking about a points to consider benefit risk handbook for our BRAP task force. We do want to align with BRATS and ASAP. Our focus will be a little bit different than SIOM's, thinking about a process to plan for benefit risk assessments and thinking about the plan for evaluating emerging benefit risk information during drug development. So we're thinking now building on the BRAD concept of BRAP. So some key considerations that could be detailed in our BRAP would be patient perspective, life cycle considerations, regional differences, and thinking about quality of life, how to address uncertainties and gaps in benefit risk, emphasizing the importance of including appropriate benefit risk endpoints and protocols and SAPs. So what we have done so far is a series of workshops to define the contents of our points to consider. We've had a lot of discussion about, what are these key things that we want to build on? And we're currently updating our project plan to cover components of a BRAP process. So our next slide. This is the last slide, kind of listing a few things as kind of an early sort of advertisement for our BRAP task force and some things we're hoping to do. Again, to build on SIOM's. So including patient perspective, presentations of key benefits and risks for program team alignment. So what is the process for aligning your benefit risk team? And how would you address knowledge gaps and uncertainty? How would you go about the process of selecting endpoints and incorporating that in plans and outputs and thinking about the data sources that might be needed? Again, more planning. So how do you plan engagement with stakeholders during the development lifecycle, and also communication with those stakeholders when you have a benefit risk summary and you're going to present key results? Also organizational considerations, the functions and the processes going on within organizations. And as I mentioned before, alignment with other documents and planning processes. Thinking about dynamic updates at different stages of the life cycle. And we like to include a worked example and a checklist for practitioners. So making it very concrete and easily implementable is our thinking at this point. So that's all I have in terms of our discussion in our BRAP perspective. I don't know if anyone has any questions. I know Mike Colby is up next as well.
Yes, I'll just say that Lisa needs to leave. So if there are any questions for Lisa, now might be a good time. Okay, well then, thank you, Lisa. And shall we continue then with Mike Colby, who is a member of the BRATS team. Mike, I believe you have some comments.
Yeah, thank you, Susan. So I'm going to give your eyes a rest for some visual simulation. Please read the publication mentioned in my bio. So I have my own disclaimer or my verbal comments that my comments reflect the views of my own views and should not be construed to represent the views or policies of my employer, UCB Bioscience. When I provided comments to SIOM's, I said that I call this report the Complete Guide to Benefit Risk. This report captures more than a decade of innovation in the benefit risk field. But that said, the field is still in its infancy. So of all my comments, I have two places where I think the report can be strengthened. While the report puts important emphasis on pharmacovigilance planning, more emphasis is also needed for benefit risk planning, or a BRAP, which is what Lisa was talking about. And the second comment is that the report needs an example that combines the clinical evidence from different data sources other than the effects table. So you may be asking yourself, why should you implement the SIOM's recommendations? So I have 5 reasons. First one is to start the life cycle approach in early drug development. Second, transition from the post hoc to proactively planned assessments. And all the speakers have mentioned this. We need to be moving towards proactively planned assessments. The third one is collect valid and reliable patient preference data. 4, utilize quantitative assessments to aid complex decision-making. And Leo mentioned a lot about quantitative methods. And 5th and last is to document the decision-making process using the BRAD. So while the CIOMS group has written a very large, complete report, they've actually put a lot of responsibility on pharma, because the real challenge right now is how do we implement these recommendations into our company processes? So there are 3 steps. First, we need to transition from that post-hoc value tree and forest plot to planned assessments using fit-for-purpose data and methods that answer more complex questions. That's not to say that I don't like the value tree and forest plot, but there's far more than just those 2 visualizations. And it's very important that we move into a fit-for-purpose data and fit-for-purpose methods. The questions are far beyond, do the benefits exceed the risk? Second, plan early for quantitative assessments requiring patient preference data. Patient preference study a couple months before your regulatory submission. Those studies take at least a year, and you need to plan early for them. And the outputs of a patient preference study can be used for your quantitative assessments. And the third and last one here is to recognize that benefit risk assessments is not a single activity, but 7 sequential activities. And those 7 activities are strategizing, planning, assessing, documenting, interpreting, reporting, and reviewing. Up until now, we'll talk value tree and forest plot. It's been very easy to do, or relatively easy to do, an assessment. But with the more quantitative methods, bringing in the patient preference information, we need to do all 7 steps. We need to break it out: strategizing, planning, assessing, documenting, interpreting, reporting, and reviewing. That will help us meet the biggest challenge that this CIOMS report has given us, and that's how to implement these recommendations into our company's processes. And that's the conclusion of my comments. Back to you, Meng-Chung and Susan.
Thank you, Mike. And thank you, everyone, for the speakers. So I guess we can formally go into the Q&A session. Susan, I think we have one more question, right? Oh, can I be back on camera, or? I think I see one more question in the chat. Are there any recommendations from a working group for product for rare and ultra rare disease? I think
Yeah, so
Lisa mentioned one of the.
Yeah,
thank you, Leo.
Yeah, Hong can comment on that, but we didn't really comment on chapter 4, but chapter 4 actually covers that that topic more in detail with specific examples.
Yeah. So yeah, I always say rare disease is really one group that with very large uncertainty, because you have very small sample size. It's infeasible to conduct a clinical trial like the other drug. So a lot of time, there's a lot of discussion, probably we did not specifically discuss in our science report, but definitely the principle is still applied. You can see when you collect the benefit evidence and risk evidence. So there is a lot of discussion around rare disease, like maybe you can use real world data to better understand the disease condition, how they impact patient without any treatment. And then you can use like a real world data to generate a control group. Like for example, in your clinical trial, you're probably not able to get the patient for control group. You can use historical control, and then there is some statistical measure. How do you use a patient's data, like in the small clinical trial, to resolve the problem specifically for rare disease? Even though it's science report did not cover the detail, but the general principle will be applied. And then you can also look through, there's a lot of literature discussion about the static method for clinical trial design for rare disease, and also how do you use real world evidence to inform the rare disease treatment.
Thank you. So Susan was asking if Michael's slide would be available. So I did reply in the chat. That's the plan. Once we get the final written format of Mike Colby's comment, we will be sending that to the group as well.
Ming-Chen, I would like to say a little bit more about the work that we've learned through our BRATS team about the work that Mike Colby and others at his company are doing in benefit risk. Mike, I don't know if you'd care to comment, but it seems that not only are you planning how to do this, you're actually doing it.
Yeah, at UCB, the statistics group, we have a very unique combination of talents where we've created a benefit risk visualization dashboard. And we have 3 phases that we're working on. The first phase is what we call the treatment level, and that's where the graphs are made from an effects table. The second phase is patient level, and we're implementing the DOOR method that Leo mentioned, where you use individual patient data and you're able to answer questions. What's the association between benefits and risks? Do the patients who experience the benefits also experience the risks? You can only do that with individual patient data. The third phase of our dashboard is quantitative, where we're bringing in methods such as multi-criteria decision analysis, where we can implement the weights that might come from a patient preference study. So we have a very well scoped out visualization dashboard.
Thanks for that description, Mike. Is that included in the publication that you mentioned that's in your bio?
Yeah, the publication is called Benefit Risk Planning Using Visualization, because it's one thing to say everybody should be planning their benefit risk. The question is, how do you do it? What questions do you need to be asking yourself so that you collect the right data, use the right methods to answer those questions? In that publication, we give you not just the big question, does the benefit exceed the risk, but the sub questions. And it's a very brief article, but it basically supports everything that you're going to be reading in the CIOMS document.
Yeah.
Mhm.
So I would like to add in what Mike say. For the life cycle, I think at each stage, the decision question could be very different. So when you do the planning and you design your study, you really need to look at what is your decision question at that each stage, and then you should have plan accordingly based on your decision.
Yeah, people think that you only do a benefit risk assessment in preparation for your regulatory submission using your
Yeah.
late phase 3 data.
Mhm.
Your benefit risk work can start, as Leo showed, I think on that Gantt chart, with your target product profile. As soon as you have that, you can get started.
Yeah, exactly. I think for this new report, we the new concept of a life cycle approach basically open up, say, your benefit risk assessment is not just for regulatory submission. Actually, it's for all the decision around your product development. So there is multiple sequential decision around your program drug development. So benefit risk assessment can be used at the stage for those to support those decisions.
Totally agree. And I do see we have one more question coming, and maybe before we address that, I want to make one more comment. So as we mentioned, Mike, Harm and Susan actually are all on our safety working group. And Mike is actually a key component in the BRADS task force as well. And as we presented earlier, we are actually working very closely with each other, BRADS, BRAP, and even ISG and ASAP. So I do want to make one more advisement that if you do find this is an interesting topic and you have ideas, please feel free to reach out to us or join us to tackle the challenges together. I guess we have one question here that from Rob. So one thing he thinks the CIOMS report could have explored further is contextualized risk minimization activities. I don't know, Leo or Hom, do you want to comment on this? The opportunities to optimize benefit risk through more optimal contextualized risk communication or mitigation.
Yeah, I just briefly replied. So CIOMS 9 actually was a foundational document around benefit risk minimization approaches. So because of that, we decided we would not engage in details in CIOMS 12, but clearly that's a key element. The more you can manage those things, the better off. So, but people already complained the document was long, so we didn't want to do any further lengthening. So.
Yeah.
It's very helpful. You can make the link. Thank you, Leo. Very important.
Yeah.
Okay, I guess, Michelle, there's no other questions from your end as well, right?
Yeah, I didn't see any further questions.
Okay, Susan, should we call this a day?
Yes, we should. Yes. So,
Okay,
would you like to do the honors, Meng-Chun?
I'll let you do the honor.
Well, thank you. Thank you, Meng-Chun, and for doing a lot of the organizing, and Michelle Zhang. Thank you very much to Hong Yang and Leo Plouffe for your, not only your presentations today, but your dedication and influence and impact on the CIOMS 12 document. Thank you to Lisa Rodriguez and Mike Colopy for your comments. And thank you to all of you for joining us today. I hope this was helpful, and we look forward to seeing you again another time.
Thanks,
Thanks,
Susan.
everyone.
Thank you all.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Bye.
Bye.
Bye.